I'm posting this under a throwaway account because I never want my family to find me. From my earliest memory, I sensed my mother hated the fact that I was born a girl. She never outright struck me, but she made sure I knew how inconvenient my existence was. Every time I showed her something from school, a drawing, a story I wrote, even a test I aced, she'd pick it apart and find the flaws. My father tried to smooth things over when he was still around, saying she was just under a lot of stress, but I noticed he never forced her to stop. He was always stuck in this limbo of hoping she'd change without actually confronting her. Then, when I was 10, he left. No warm goodbye, no custody battle. He left me a short note saying he was sorry, and then he disappeared. My mother's reaction was chilling. She informed me he'd left both of us, as though we were two items on a curb. She didn't cry or seem sad, she just gave me this look of condescending triumph, like she'd won. After that, life became a dreary series of routines. I cooked for myself unless she decided to make something she knew I despised. I washed my own clothes, walked to school alone, and came home to find her either out on dates or silently watching TV. If I asked for money to buy school supplies, she acted as though I were draining her life savings. She'd make me wait days before grudgingly handing me a few bills, telling me to be grateful she bothered at all. I remember when I was 11, my class was going on a field trip, and the cost was minimal. She refused to pay. When I pleaded with her, explaining that all my friends would be going, she sniffed and said, "Sounds like you need new friends." That's when I realized she took a twisted pleasure in denying me normal childhood experiences. I tried to convince myself that it was some misguided attempt to teach me independence, but I gradually saw the truth. She didn't want me around, period. When I was 14, she started dating Alan, a man with a 12-year-old son named Tyler. At first, I didn't mind. Alan was nice enough. He asked me generic questions about school, actually listened for 10 seconds, then drifted back to whatever he and my mother were discussing. Tyler was polite at first, a little shy. I thought maybe we could get along. But then, my mother turned every interaction into a show of how wonderful Tyler was. I'd walk into the living room and see them giggling over some video. The second she noticed me, her face would stiffen. She'd send me to fetch something or tell me to tidy up. Tyler rarely made eye contact with me after that. Over time, it became obvious that she was lavishing all the affection she'd denied me onto Tyler. She took him shopping for sports gear, bragged about his soccer skills to every neighbor, and posted dozens of photos of them grinning side by side. I was not in a single photo. Even Alan seemed slightly uncomfortable, but he never said anything to discourage her. When Tyler moved in, I found my posters in the trash. My mother said, "They're childish," then replaced them with Tyler's trophies and his team pictures. She painted his room in bright colors, calling it our new family project. Meanwhile, my room remained the same drab space I'd always had, except now it often served as storage for boxes of Tyler's off-season gear. I tried to keep the peace. If I didn't speak much, I reasoned, she'd have no ammunition. I focused on my schoolwork, hoping my grades would get me a scholarship somewhere far away. My mother seemed happy to ignore me, except to demand chores or wave off any question I had about dinner. I ate whatever scraps I could find if she bothered to cook, usually the meals Tyler disliked. One evening, I noticed something off about my plate of spaghetti. A strange, bitter aftertaste lingered in my mouth and my stomach cramped a few hours later. My mother stood by the sink, watching me with a smug smile. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Maybe the sauce had gone bad. But I couldn't forget that look on her face. It was too satisfied. Over the next few weeks, I caught her smirking whenever I ate something she prepared. Often, I'd feel queasy later, but never enough to go to the hospital. Suspicion gnawed at me. Could she really be tampering with my food? I decided to set up a small camera. It was cheap, not the best quality, but I hid it on top of a cabinet in the kitchen, angled just right to capture the counter where she usually prepped meals. I labeled my leftovers and told her I planned to eat them the next day, making sure they were in a distinct container. Then I went to hang out at a friend's place for a few hours. Later that night, with my heart hammering, I checked the footage. She walked into the kitchen, glanced around, and took my container out of the fridge. She opened it, rummaged under the sink, then sprinkled something into my food. The camera wasn't high definition, but it clearly showed her holding a little container of powdered cleaner we kept for scrubbing the stove. She stirred it into my leftovers. Then, unbelievably, she put the container back, sealed it, and gave a little sneer as she closed the fridge. My blood ran cold. All these years of her passive-aggressive digs and cold demeanor were nothing compared to this. She was literally poisoning me. The next day, I faked eating those leftovers and tossed them out in a public bin far from home. For a while, I felt numb, not sure what to do. Going to the police immediately sounded logical, but I was still a minor, and I'd heard horror stories about the foster care system. Plus, I worried nobody would believe me, or she'd claim I fabricated the footage. So I resolved to gather more evidence. I bought a few small cameras online, stashed them around the kitchen and living room, and even started recording audio of her snide remarks. My mother continued her campaign, tampering with any food she thought I'd eat. She sometimes made sly comments to Tyler, who would giggle but never confront her. Alan seemed blissfully ignorant, though I suspected he was just relieved she wasn't making his life difficult. When I turned 16, my mother's hostility escalated. She openly criticized me in front of Alan, calling me a dead weight who contributed nothing. He'd sometimes glance at me apologetically, but he never defended me. She started restricting what groceries I could access, labeling things as Tyler's so I wouldn't dare touch them. I got a part-time job walking dogs and babysitting just to buy my own necessities. With every small pay I received, I put a little aside. I wanted a safety net for the day I could finally leave. That safety net grew slowly, but so did my collection of evidence. I caught her sprinkling powders, liquids, even small crushed pills into my meals. Fortunately, I'd gotten good at pretending to eat. I'd either flush it down the toilet or quietly discard it outside. I documented everything, saving the footage on multiple USB drives and an online backup. It was horrifying to rewatch these clips, seeing my mother's face twist with satisfaction as she attempted to harm me. But it hardened my resolve. I would not confront her prematurely. I had to wait until I was sure she couldn't weasel out of punishment. Meanwhile, she basked in playing doting mother to Tyler, bringing him new clothes and gadgets, celebrating every trivial milestone in his life. He reveled in her attention, shooting me smug looks whenever she praised him for something simple. Their little alliance sickened me, but I kept my head down. I sometimes fantasized about revenge, about watching her pay for the horrible things she'd done. Yet, I also had to be practical. If I left before graduation, I'd jeopardize my schooling and any chance of scholarships. When I was 17, I secretly met with a teacher I trusted. I showed her a short clip of my mother tampering with my food. The teacher was horrified and helped me contact a lawyer who specialized in minors dealing with abuse. He advised that, while I could go to the authorities now, my mother might spin it as a rebellious teen forging videos. We decided to keep collecting irrefutable evidence. My 18th birthday was less than a year away. If I could hold out until then, I'd have more legal standing to press charges as an adult, and she wouldn't be able to manipulate me further. During that final year, my mother's bitterness intensified. Alan still remained mostly on the sidelines, but he occasionally complained that things felt tense. She'd wave him off or blame me, saying I was difficult to handle. Tyler was enjoying his teenage years, oblivious or indifferent to my suffering. Sometimes, I'd see him rummaging in my room without permission, likely trying to find anything he could use against me, or amuse himself by violating my privacy. I started locking my door when I wasn't home, but my mother would override my lock if she felt like it. I continued to gather recordings, both video and audio. I documented verbal tirades where she called me worthless and implied that I should just leave if you hate it here so much. Once, I overheard her telling Tyler she wished she'd never had a daughter, that her life would have been easier. Tyler laughed, and I realized he'd become her co-conspirator, happy to watch me suffer as long as it kept him in her good graces. Finally, the day I graduated high school arrived. My mother and Tyler didn't come to the ceremony. Alan showed up briefly but left right after I got my diploma. I wasn't disappointed. Their absence only confirmed what I'd known all along. Instead, I focused on my plan. I had a small storage unit where I'd been moving my belongings a bit at a time. That evening, I packed up the last of my essential items, including my hidden cameras and USB drives. My mother ambled into the living room, suspicious but not alarmed. She probably assumed I was bluffing whenever I talked about leaving. I told her plainly, "I'm moving out." She wore a mocking half-smile as if to say, "Good riddance." Tyler hung back, arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen. That's when I brought up the videos. Her expression faltered for a moment, then she scoffed, claiming I was making things up. I pulled out my phone and showed her a single clip of her sprinkling powder into my food. Her face went white. Tyler's eyes bulged. Alan, who just walked in, demanded to know what was going on. I calmly explained I had months of footage of her attempting to poison me, plus diaries she'd written long ago stating how she regretted ever having a daughter. She lunged at me, shrieking that I was a liar. Alan had to hold her back. Tyler shouted something about how I was ruining everything. I informed them all that I'd already backed up the videos and sent copies to my lawyer. If she tried to contact me again, or if Tyler tried any intimidation, I'd go straight to the police. Then I walked out the door, leaving them in stunned silence. I moved into a tiny, rundown apartment, but it was mine. I got a second part-time job, scraping by on cheap groceries and hardly any furniture. It didn't matter. I could breathe. I wasn't constantly checking my food for poison. I started therapy, trying to unpack the years of psychological damage. My therapist was the one who really encouraged me not to wait any longer to press charges. She said, "This isn't just about you. What if she does this to someone else?" On my 18th birthday, I walked into a police station with my lawyer. We handed over everything: the camera footage, the diaries, screenshots of her texts threatening me after I left. The police seemed shocked but took it seriously. Child endangerment, attempted poisoning, assault. They rattled off potential charges. My mother was taken in for questioning. She claimed I'd doctored the videos. Then they showed her the diaries and made her listen to the audio recordings of her laughing about tainting my food. She couldn't worm her way out of that. Tyler was questioned too. He was flustered, contradicting himself, trying to shield his mother. Alan claimed ignorance, which might have been partially true, but the investigators weren't thrilled with how little he'd noticed. The case moved forward quickly, given how explicit the evidence was. My mother made bail thanks to Alan, but when the preliminary hearing came, the prosecution presented enough to ensure this was heading to trial. My mother's lawyer tried the angle that she wasn't in her right mind, that it was a stress-induced breakdown. The prosecutor dismantled that excuse by pointing out the repeated, methodical nature of her actions supported by camera footage. She wasn't lashing out once or twice. She was doing this regularly, with planning and intent. Tyler wasn't charged with anything criminal, but his role as an onlooker who sometimes egged her on was noted. Alan tried to plead with me, saying Tyler's future would be ruined if I kept going. I told him that Tyler's future was not my concern after he stood by and watched his mother poison me. Alan didn't have a reply to that. At the trial, I sat on the witness stand, describing the fear I lived with. I explained how she'd poisoned my meals, how I had the presence of mind to avoid ingesting too much once I caught on. The prosecution showed clip after clip, each worse than the last. My mother giggling, making nasty remarks about how I might lose weight or learn a lesson. The defense tried to argue lack of harmful intent, but that crumbled under the sheer volume of evidence. Lab tests on the substances confirmed they were harmful chemicals, entirely unfit for consumption. In one instance, the powder could cause serious internal damage if taken in large quantities. When the guilty verdict came, I felt something break inside me, a final release. The judge pronounced her guilty on multiple counts, including child endangerment and attempted assault. She was sentenced to several years in prison. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was enough to ensure she'd carry that label forever. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I ever had, with no intention of offering her any mercy or forgiveness. She'd tried to rid herself of me, and she failed. Now she was the one banished from normal life. Alan didn't speak to me after the trial. I heard through old neighbors that he divorced her and moved away with Tyler. Maybe they couldn't stand the shame, or maybe he finally realized the kind of person he'd been living with. Either way, I didn't care. My mother's new perfect family was in ruins. She'd orchestrated her own downfall by pushing me too far, forgetting that I had more resilience and intelligence than she ever gave me credit for. The diaries that once spelled out her hatred for me became key pieces of evidence, sealing her fate. Some people who hear my story ask if I ever consider reconciliation. They assume I might soften over time, especially since she's my mother. But I refuse. She tried to poison me, laughed as I ate tainted food. There's no forgiveness in my heart for someone who intentionally harmed me and took pleasure in it. My revenge was thorough and final, seeing her in handcuffs, forced to face the truth in a courtroom, and then thrown behind bars. I owe her nothing. I won't visit her in prison. I won't write letters. As far as I'm concerned, she ceased to exist in my life the day the judge delivered the verdict. I've moved on. I'm in college now, thanks to scholarships I worked hard to earn. It's a tough balancing act with finances, but I take pride in my independence. No one can dictate what I eat or what I wear. I have a small circle of friends who know bits of my past. They're supportive and never push me to talk about it more than I want to. Therapy has been my safe space to dissect the trauma, but my main focus is building a future that's entirely mine. I dream of having a career that gives me stability, maybe even starting a family on my own terms one day, if I decide I want one. Sometimes I still have nightmares about her standing over my shoulder, whispering that I'm worthless. But then I wake up and remember that she's locked away, that the system she tried so hard to manipulate turned against her once the evidence came to light. Those nightmares grow less frequent with time. Instead of her voice, I hear my own, reminding me of what I overcame. In moments of reflection, I think back to the first time I realized something was deeply wrong with our relationship. I was 6, holding up a picture I'd drawn, hoping for just a smile. She gave me the most forced, tight-lipped grin and said, "Why are the arms so long?" That tiny moment crystallized years later into the certainty that she would never love me. I've accepted that fact. She picked the wrong person to underestimate. She might have destroyed me if she'd been a bit subtler or if I'd been more naive, but I was done letting her walk all over me the second I tasted that bitter tang in my food and saw her smirk. People often say the best revenge is living well. In my case, the best revenge was also ensuring she faced real consequences. I don't regret a single step I took to collect and preserve evidence. I don't regret pressing charges. If I could rewind time, I'd do it all again. Let her rot. She never wanted me in her life, and now she gets to live without me, in a cell where she can't hurt anyone else. I've blocked any attempts at contact from her. She sent me letters at first, alternating between furious threats and hollow pleas. I handed them directly to my lawyer, adding them to the growing stack of evidence. She tried calling, and I changed my number. When she's eventually released, I hope she understands there's nothing left between us. I've carved out my own identity, separate from her twisted world. My father never stepped in to rescue me, and she used that abandonment as a weapon for years. It's ironic that she ended up abandoned herself by Alan and Tyler, by neighbors who once admired her superficial charm, and most importantly, by the daughter she despised. I might never fully heal from what happened, but each day I distance myself further from the person she tried to break. I'm proud of who I'm becoming, someone who refused to be silent in the face of evil. She taught me one lesson inadvertently, to never let anyone dictate my worth. If there's any shred of gratitude I might have, it's that I learned early on how to survive. So, that's the story. My mother loathed having a daughter so much that she tried to push me out of her precious new family and even tampered with my food to accomplish it. She smirked as I swallowed who knows what. But in the end, I got the last laugh. She sits in prison, stripped of her maternal facade, and I'm here, rebuilding my life. There's no forgiveness. I'm not interested in cathartic closure with hugs and tears. Revenge was the only fitting resolution, and trust me, it was extremely satisfying to watch her face justice. If she ever wonders why I didn't just disappear quietly, maybe she'll recall that day in the courtroom when I stood up and told the whole truth. That's the day she lost everything she pretended to hold dear. I'm sharing my story because people sometimes assume mother knows best. In my case, my mother knew exactly what she was doing, and it was malicious to the core. If anyone reading this is going through something similar, know that you're not crazy for suspecting foul play. Document everything. Tell someone you trust. You don't have to forgive atrocities committed against you, especially by someone who's supposed to protect you. Sometimes, the only closure is to see justice served. I live free now, free from her smirks, her sabotage, her relentless disdain. I don't worry about whether she approves of my clothes or scoffs at my dreams. I don't flinch at every creak in the house, wondering if she's lurking. And I don't have to eat anything with hidden poison. That alone is worth every moment I spent planning her downfall, because that's exactly what I did. I took all her hatred, gathered proof of it, and turned it into the weapon that sent her to prison. I guess a part of me wishes things had been different. If she'd loved me, if my father had stayed, if we could have been a normal family. But wishing changes nothing. Action did. My final act was refusing to let her get away with attempted murder. I hope that's a clear enough message. She wrote me off as a burden, tried to dispose of me, and failed. I walked out stronger than ever. So, while I'll never have the kind of childhood some people take for granted, I've built a future that's entirely mine. That's the greatest revenge I could possibly ask for.